Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have everyone here today. This session is going to be led by three of us. And as we go through the presentation, we each kind of have a chunk and we're going to introduce ourselves and our individual organizations. We've structured this, each of the three of us work at a different land trust conservation organization on the island of Nantucket. And while we're all organizations that are associated with conservation and ecology and the natural world, we're all also very different organizations. So we thought that together we could provide some background to how each of our organizations are approaching the question of climate change, how climate change is a part of what our mission and our work is, and talk about some of the opportunities that we've had for communication, stewardship, planning, and research that surround climate change. Next, please. So, excuse me, as I mentioned, there are three of us, and we'll introduce ourselves as we go along. But we work for three different conservation organizations on the island. So you hear from representatives of the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, Linda Loring Nature Foundation, and the Nantucket Land Council. And you'll see each of our contact information here, and it'll also be put up at the end of the presentation as well. Next. So I'm going first. I'm Jen Karberg. I'm a research program supervisor with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation on Nantucket. You can see our mission here. We are a land trust organization that owns a significant amount of land outright, and we conduct research and management around those properties, kind of with the mission of maintaining the things that are unique and special about Nantucket. Next. So this is a map of the island of Nantucket. The areas in green are those properties owned by the Conservation Foundation, or NCF. We own a little over 9,000 acres on the island. It is about 30%. And so we're the largest actual landowner on the island. And as such, we kind of operate under the umbrella that we have a responsibility to really understand what's unique about our natural properties and make sure that our management is taking that into account. So we have a full-time science staff, and we do land management that has an ecological benefit. We do restoration for ecological benefit. We have research that we conduct both to understand just the general ecology and natural history of the island, but also research to understand how our restoration and management is impacting that ecological function. So as you can see, that's kind of the underlying theme to everything we do is how is our work improving or enhancing the ecology of the island? So climate change needs to wrap into that. Next, please. So in the past couple of years, even though we know that a lot of our work has had a climate change focus, it's been an interest, we've really been trying to actively roll climate change into our mission and into the work that we're doing and think about our work through that lens of climate change. And today I'm going to talk about three kind of components of that. One is land management, the other is ecological research, and then the last is community engagement. Next, please. So adapting our land management to climate change. So we own a lot of property, and a lot of that has a management component to it, whether it's human use of the property or managing for ecological resources. So one of the steps that we are starting to take is how do we analyze and look at that land management through a climate change lens. So kind of one of the first steps we've started to do, and we'll eventually do this systematically for all of our properties, but is to take the resources that exist about climate change and overlay them onto our property. And in Massachusetts, we actually have a lot of resources that you can find online that you can analyze what is going on in your property. And I've listed a few of them here that we've used quite a bit. The sea level rise predictions for our properties, looking at the SLAM analysis, which is the modeling that predicts coastal habitat change, salt marsh migration. On Nantucket, we recently had FEMA do and conducted an erosion analysis for the island. We also have CZM's erosion predictions, all things that we can use to analyze our properties. So laying that, over our property boundaries, we can look for conflicts with our current land use and also think about what we know about that property to help determine how we can strategically adjust our land management and access to the property. Next, please. As an example, this is one of our properties called Eel Point. It is predominantly, it's about half a salt marsh on the southern end, and then the northern end is a coastal dune system with kind of an evolving salt marsh accreting beach area, all accessed via sand roads. So sand roads that people were accessing with ORV use. And where the purplish pink line is, that's a road that we began seeing flooding in, occasional flooding over time. And so we started to analyze it with our knowledge of what was happening on the property and then looking at the resources. Next, please. This is the SLAM analysis, the base SLAM analysis that's supposed to be current day, which was really 2011 when they did this. But the pink line is still there for the road. The light green that's just to the south of that pink line is irregularly flooded marsh. So it's a functioning salt marsh that's not flooding all the time, but you can see that portions of the road are just edging into that green area. Next, please. So looking at predicted change with the SLAM analysis, this is the 2070 map. What we're seeing now is all of that irregularly flooded marsh has turned into regularly flooded marsh. So we're low marsh pretty much all the way up to where that road barrier is, in some cases past it. In some places, there's predictions for tidal flats evolving back there. So looking at the models, we can see that what we honestly thought was true is predicted by the models, and that the salt marsh wants to migrate into where that road is. Easy land management decision to close the road and not allow vehicular access anymore. So we actually did close that road in 2020, and it's easy because it's all on our property. We can make that adjustment pretty quickly, and we've actually seen salt marsh starting to recruit in the road itself. So that's one way we've adapted with the data to how we're managing this particular property. Next, please. Another maybe more complicated discussion about adaptation. This is a salt marsh that we own. And on the southern end of it, you can see a road just on the boundary there. And where there's a yellow circle, there's a culvert under that road that is supposed to connect that salt marsh to other salt marsh south of the road. Next, please. What we're seeing is that that culvert is undersized, and we're getting flooding onto that road in significant high tides and storm events. And we're actually seeing widening of the creek within the salt marsh. So ecologically it's impacted, but also we have an access problem here. NCF doesn't own the road, it's the town road. So this is a project where we have to work in partnership with the town of Nantucket, DPW, to start figuring out how we adapt a better road design here so we can keep having access adapted to sea level rise, but also be able to restore the salt marsh on either side. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation, but this is one of those collaborations where we have to balance the access that's needed for the town, as well as making sure that whatever is changed has an ecological benefit. So that's something that's in progress. Next, please. So I'm going to switch to research for a moment. We have, as I mentioned, a year-round full-time science staff within our organization, and we have a lot of research projects that we conduct on our properties. One of the areas that we research are sandplain grasslands, which are a globally rare habitat, biodiversity hotspot. And as you can see from this map here on the red dots, if you can see those on your screen, they're really contained in the coastal areas of New England, a lot on Nantucket, a lot of the remaining habitats, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, with some on Cape Cod and Long Island. We own, of the property that NCF owns, we have a significant portion of these rare habitats. And we're starting to see climate change impacts. They're an early successional habitat, but we have a reduced ability to conduct prescribed fire to maintain the rare species that are out there. Due to changes in temperature timing, precipitation. They're also a coastally restricted habitat, so erosion is an issue, as you can imagine. Next, please. So this map here shows our head of the plains property. And in yellow, I've kind of outlined the significant sandplain grassland areas that we've been maintaining through prescribed fire and mowing and other management for a number of years. It's a really great, beautiful piece of property. Laid over it with the color here is the FEMA coastal erosion hazard mapping that happened just 2 years ago that combines sea level rise and erosion projections. And you can see that it's predicted that about a third of that grassland habitat will vanish through significant erosion of that South Shore. So we can think about how to maintain the habitats where they are, but the question that we're asking next, and Sarah, if you can hit the next again, please, is can we create habitat in areas where it's not as subjected to erosion? So the blue area is actually an area where we're researching different management techniques to take an adjacent, really shrubby area and see if we can turn it into a sandplain grassland that has a similar ecological function to what exists in the grasslands we've been maintaining long-term. So knowing we're going to lose them and we can't stop that erosion, how can we adapt to where we still have some of that rare, globally rare habitat? Next, please. So another research project that we're working on is a project to increase coastal resilience. So we have a ton of coastal properties and we're looking at ways we can really effectively protect coastal resources in an ecological way. This is a project that we just implemented this year in November. We actually constructed an oyster reef, which is what we're seeing an aerial photo of our layers of linear oyster reef using oyster castles that were constructed in front of a salt marsh that has some erosion impacts going on in it. And this reef is staggered, it reduces wave height, slows down wave impacts to the shoreline, hopefully to help reduce erosion happening within the salt marsh itself. And we will be tracking that over time. We will also hopefully improve water quality in the area and potentially, hopefully, maybe see some expansion of that salt marsh towards the oyster reef itself, which would be kind of exciting. Next, Sarah. As far as research outcomes, this project is the first of its kind that was permitted in Massachusetts. So we're hoping that it can provide a pilot project and information for other organizations that might want to use something similar to increase coastal resilience. It also allowed us to collaborate and partner with many different organizations, and some of this project was funded by the Nantucket Shellfish Association, as well as the Massachusetts In Lieu Fee program. And the research will inform other restoration efforts, and it also helps raise regional awareness of the work that NCF is doing. Next, please. So that kind of brings me to the next and last piece, which is community engagement and how our land trust is able to share the expertise that we have on our staff. And this kind of goes to the point that a land trust, particularly a nonprofit land trust, needs to think about how we're raising our profile and awareness of the work that our organization does. And one of those ways is to share our expert staff participation in local government, in regional conferences, workshops such as this, educational initiatives, and collaborative projects. And I highlighted collaborative projects here because I find this very important. We can often get lost in the nonprofit world of elevating yourself and not everybody else. And I think collaboration is a way that everyone can kind of participate in possible solutions towards climate change and increase awareness of your organization as well. Next, please, Sarah. So this is something that NCF, that the Conservation Foundation, has been involved in quite a bit lately, is how we can take our staff experience on climate change issues and share that or be involved in outreach efforts. And these are some of the ways we've done that. Nantucket has a Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee for the island. This is a governmental body. It's tasked with overseeing the development of an entire island-wide coastal resilience plan. And actually now we've just developed that plan, so we're doing implementation. And NCF has staff that are on that committee to help give, expert advice on what we know about the island and what we're studying about the island to contribute to coastal resiliency efforts. We initiated a Nantucket coastal ecology course in collaboration with the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, and Sarah will be representing that organization in a moment. But we've been teaching a 5-week course to help increase local knowledge about coastal issues and hence climate change issues. So sharing the knowledge that we have in the research that we're doing with the community at large. And we also have a book club that we just concluded in collaboration with some organizations on island, where we read and discussed the story of Moore, which is a really great book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. But talking about climate change in a really accessible way and actually realizing that there's probably a community of people on island that really want to talk about climate change solutions. So figuring out how to foster and continue that communication. Next, please, Sarah. And then the last is that we partnered with the Envision Resilience Challenge, with the Nantucket Challenge and also the Narragansett Bay Challenge, where we provide expert advice to this program that actually is using graduate students to inspire communities to kind of imagine adaptive change. And this image here is an image of a spot in Nantucket Harbor that right now is quite developed with a major road and structures and parking lots. And students used data and adaptive drawing techniques to envision a way that you could respond to climate change and invite people and nature to use a space together. And it's a way to kind of inspire discussions about change. And so we've been excited to participate in those discussions as well. Next, Sarah. So to wrap up kind of my section, as a land trust that has a science research staff and significant land resources, we can really focus our strengths towards dealing with climate change impacts. And for us, that's really looking at adaptive land management techniques, figuring out how we can conduct informative research and restoration, as well as figuring out how to build collaborations and really contribute our expertise to the bigger conversation. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sarah.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Jen, and thanks everybody again for being here today. So I am Sarah Bois. I'm the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, which is also on Nantucket. I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization and what we do, and also take a kind of step back and thinking of kind of peppering the talk with some of what we do, but you know, we had the title of practical advice, and so we're going to try to talk about some other ways or lots of different options for how land trusts can involve discussions of climate change and climate change aspects in kind of all aspects of what we do. And so I'm going to dovetail a lot with what Jen was just talking about, but talk a little bit more about coastal resiliency as open space and land trust as a coastal resiliency and biodiversity asset. So Linda Loring Nature Foundation is a little different, or actually in some ways it's a lot different than what Jen was just describing with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. And so we were also hoping that with this audience, that between myself, Jen, and Emily, that you'll maybe be able to identify with one of our organizations where you are and take pieces of what each of us are doing. So we are one property. We have 275 acres on the western end of the island, so close to where Jen was talking about the Eel Point property example. So we're really place-based with that 275 acres. This is our mission right here. We connect all people of all ages to nature through environmental education and research. So close up, this is what our property looks like. The yellow is our boundary. Also, in contrast to NCF, we have this one property and we don't have coastal habitat. So, you know, just because, you know, we're an island, not everything is always involved around erosion and immediate sea level rise from that, you know, visible sea level rise from the coastal areas. I'm going to talk about how that differs a little bit for our property, but we are considered a wildlife sanctuary, and then we are open for passive recreation. So like the pink areas are our walking trails. The green and blue areas on the eastern side of the property are currently closed to the public, but we're hoping to be designing some trails along that side to open up the property soon. And so even without a coastal property, we all serve a role in talking about climate change. So as I said before, we really are highlight education and research in our mission. And so because the land is kind of the main focus of our organization, the three legs of our stool, if you will, are stewardship, research, and education. And one of the Jen was talking about involving discussions of climate change with the evolving mission of NCF. And similarly, we in 2020, we went through a strategic planning process for the organization. And we really started incorporating discussions of climate change impacts and ideas through all aspects of our strategic planning. So clearly through stewardship, definitely through research, and also through education, which is like community outreach. And I'll talk about some of those different aspects. But I would also argue that in terms of other aspects of strategic planning, that we can involve discussions of climate change. So whether it's land acquisition, depending on what type of organization you are, donor relations and fundraising, I think there's an avenue to kind of weave this discussions of climate change kind of through all aspects of land trusts. So taking a step back from Linda Loring Nature Foundation specifically, I really think that land trust and open space can really be resiliency assets. And here I wrote coastal resiliency, but resiliency in general. So the very first way a lot of us think about it is the physical land itself. So open space has, physical space for mitigation strategies. So Jen highlighted some really novel things that the NCF has instituted, like with the oyster castles, that the artificial reef. And so thinking of, the land itself and the space we have as a place to test out new mitigation strategies, and then, kind of be physical barriers in many ways for storm surge and wave action. I'm saying we, I mean the big we of open space and land can often be looked at as protection for infrastructure. If there's open space and conservation land of some sort between the water bodies and or the direct impacts of erosion and our infrastructure, roads, houses, and that kind of thing, then the community can see the additional asset of this open space. And then maintaining habitat health and connectivity. So the work that we all do in land trusts, whether we're protecting the land itself, the ecosystems, the species, we're also providing or protecting and increasing the biodiversity of these habitats. And we know for many different types of avenues of research that the higher biodiversity yields more resilient landscapes. And so that's another service that these our land trusts can provide, is by being a more resilient landscape just by the work that we do to protect biodiversity. So I think of another way I think of our land trust as being a resilient asset is looking at the effects or documenting the effects of climate change impacts. So, Jen was referencing the research staff at NCF. I have a smaller research program, but we also do a lot of education and community citizen science programs, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And in that way, we see a responsibility to observe impacts of climate change, record those impacts, and communicate about them. And that can be in lots of different avenues, and I'll touch on some of those in a minute. But I think owning or being stewards of these landscapes, we're some of the first eyes on the ground for seeing the impacts of climate change, and that can also be our responsibility. And then, as I mentioned before, we can also be a location for implementing resilient strategies. Then we can preserve, protect, and increase biodiversity. And then part of increasing and protecting that biodiversity is further reducing stressors. So a lot of the work that we as land trust organizations have been doing for decades, protecting and enhancing our biodiversity, remediating the effects of overuse and misuse of our properties, invasive species issues, all of those can be seen now in a climate change light, because the more stress we reduce on these environments, the more resilient they're going to be to the various aspects of climate change. And once again, I just love to keep highlighting this. More biodiversity is a more resilient landscape. So we don't have to completely change what we do as land trust. We can frame it in a different way to think about that work. A lot of the work we're already doing, a lot of the work we've been presenting for years at this Mass Land Trust Conference is actually further enhancing our ability to be resilient. So we know that our climate is changing. This is not new. I put this in here because I think about, for Massachusetts, many of you have probably seen this graphic before as our migrating climate. And so we, think often about temperatures, but we also on Nantucket, a lot of us think about the ocean temperatures as well, and our waters are warming. And as we're starting to really experience the effects of these warming temperatures, we're asking a lot of questions. And this can be both as a researcher, these might be some of the first questions I think about when I want to design a research project, but also as land managers, what are we going to be seeing in our landscape that we need to manage for and mitigate for? So our species range is shifting. Are there novel ecosystems now as precipitation changes, as temperatures change and warming temperatures arriving at different times can create these novel ecosystems? What about new introductions? And how will our ecosystems that respond to these new introductions? Will our flora and fauna be responding in unison or individually to warming temperatures? There's just an endless amount of questions. And so I was just going to talk about a few climate change indicators that a lot of us are thinking about, both as researchers, because it's kind of an interesting, but also as land managers, what are we seeing? And so these are some examples that we've seen locally on Nantucket. So the first thing I wanted to think about were range shifts. So these aren't necessarily species that we see as an invasive species. It's more about being more prevalent on the landscape. So our first picture is turkey vultures. It's one of my favorite species. When I was first on Nantucket in the late 1990s, turkey vultures were very rarely seen, and kind of if you went on a bird walk and somebody saw a turkey vulture, it was actually noteworthy. And then over time, the population has shifted so that the range of turkey vultures, we have resident birds now. There's a full breeding population. And so that's been a full species range shift. Our short-eared owls have been moving further north as a species. We've had, I don't remember the last time a short-eared owl nested in our, been noted in our grasslands. And then we think about the waters around Nantucket, where there's been observations and then further a lot of research showing that lobster populations are moving north because of the warming temperatures. And then in their habitat niches, we see black sea bass moving in. And these are things that a lot of people are observing, not just the researchers, it's the community that we can kind of note these, climate change indicators for them. The blueberry picture is, the commercial application that I was thinking about. We don't commercially harvest our blueberries on Nantucket. We have lots and lots of blueberry species or blueberry plants and species, but we know that, the blueberry production is also moving north. So there's lots of different, both as a land trust, but then as, it being members of the community, there's lots of things that are shifting their ranges. I added on here the EdMaps, eBird, and iNaturalist for those of you who are thinking about community science and citizen science applications. These are all things that are used to kind of track species. And we know from many decades of citizen science work that some of the first changes to species ranges, whether they're new introductions of a non-native species or ranges shifting more naturally, that citizens on the ground and people on the ground are really the first indicators, and often not professionals, are the first people to see changes to the environment. And I put, new and invasive species. A lot of us at Land Trust are kind of battling the fight of invasive species as we manage our landscapes. So as land managers, knowing which species are going to be new problems for us all are really important. So thinking as the climate's changing, we're seeing not only new species enter an area like these spotted lanternflies, but species that have been on the landscape for some time that now the maybe the winter climates are more suitable. So for Nantucket, for example, we've been seeing both Scotch broom and English ivy. We're noting that they are becoming more reproductive. In the past, the harsh winters have kind of knocked them back. Kudzu has been present in Massachusetts for many decades and only more recently has been expanding. And we believe it's primarily due to temperature and more suitable habitat. So this, these kinds of things we're looking at with, once again, iNaturalist and EdMaps and other community science applications. And I think a lot of land trusts, mine included, do a lot of education where we encourage the public to use these types of citizen science programs. And that's another way that we can support kind of educating our community about climate change impacts. One of the pieces of research that I conduct at Linda Loring is looking at our changing phenology. So how nature's timing is changing. This is not only, for research purposes, but it also has management implications when we're thinking about what's time of year should we be, removing certain invasive species as they leaf out earlier than everything else. There's many species, some of which we, care more about perhaps if they're considered rare, about their timing. We are tracking, for example, our tree swallows are a migratory bird species that's in decline. We have a project going on looking at nest box success and looking at the timing of egg laying and thus hatch out, and seeing what we can do to provide more nest boxes in the appropriate locations to further enhance the success of that declining species. Caterpillars and certain spring flowering plants that are really sensitive to temperature. We're noticing lots of responses to earlier spring timing. A lot of them are subject to late frost. And so this is an area of research that is expanding and continuing. And as a land trust, we have the luxury of being able to collect a long-term data set. So if you're, relying on academic institutions often to collect these type of data, there's usually a limited time span of 3 to 5 years for grant cycles. And as land trusts, we can start collecting these data and note that change that's happening at a decadal level. And so I had, these kind of couple of slides of some practical bullet points. It depends what your land trust mission and goals are, about how practical they are for you. But I was thinking a lot about how, as land trusts, in the work I do with a lot of community outreach, that opportunity to observe, record, and communicate about the effects of climate change. So looking at our warming temperatures, our earlier springs, I mentioned our phenology research. We surround one of our great ponds, so looking at pond temperatures, water levels, and salinity, since it is a brackish pond, and tidally influenced, which I'll mention in a minute. We also look at the timing of bird arrivals, I mentioned, as well as our native pollinators. And then we collect precipitation at our site level, because we know that precipitation is changing with climate change, and it's really erratic and less easily predictable. So by collecting site level data, we can kind of start to get a baseline where we can note change as well. And then in terms of education, I really feel like our job at Land Trust can be both direct and indirect. So obviously we can have classes. Jen mentioned that we're going to be teaching our second round of coastal ecology for Nantucket this spring. We have, children's classes and field trips and that kind of thing. We can also, if it's not an in-house area of expertise, we can host speakers, we can host workshops. There's lots of different things that we can do to educate the public. And we're also really strongly believe in meeting people where they are. So I mentioned, we don't have coastal property, but we're an island, and a lot of people make their living on the water or recreate on the water. And so things like the changing fisheries, both the species changes and also the timing. So we have a lot of migratory species, such as the striped bass, that's in this picture as an example, that are a prize fishery for recreation. And so people follow this migration map of looking at what the temperature of the water is and where the species are and who's going to catch the first striped bass. And it's a real opportunity to talk about how that's changed over time. So meeting people where they're at with what they're interested in is really important. You know, a lot of people love bird migration, note the first osprey every year. I think the first osprey was 2 days ago. The Conservation Foundation's Director of Science and Stewardship, Karen Beatty, was the first one to spot it anyway. So, you know, the timing of things and how it relates to temperature can be a really great source to open up a lot of these conversations about climate change. And then really briefly, you know, this is, you might recognize the yellow boundary as the property at Lindell Nature Foundation I mentioned before. These different color patterns are 3, 6, and 9 foot sea level rise to show, you know, how our land is going to be potentially impacted with different levels of climate change. So not different levels of climate change, but under different scenario. So basically what I wanted to show is that as a land trust, while the person as being responsible for the management plans and kind of making the management decisions for the property, it's shocking to me when I say, oh my gosh, like half of our property is going to be flooded in some way. These are freshwater wetlands that will be impacted as the pond is filled through sea level rise. But you can also look at that. This is an example of where I was talking before about our land as land trust being a site to allow the water to come. It's a mitigating factor for the other parts of the community. There's a lot of houses on the other side of our property that are, you know, if we kind of we have a most resilient landscape that can take on water, hold water, and then filter it out, then there's more opportunity for the infrastructure on the other side of our property to sort of, you know, this can be kind of slow the process, I guess, or be a mitigating factor. The one thing I'll point out, though, is that the southern part of our property, there is a road that's a kind of heavily used road that's also quite impacted. And in this next slide is that same pond and roadway, which is a different angle. And this is a page from the draft, actually, of our coastal resiliency plan. It has been since adopted this winter, so it's no longer in draft form, but I had this photo to show some of the recommendations were to assist with ecological restoration, planting along roads, to have some green infrastructure. And there is an opportunity for organizations like ours to work with the town, with the municipalities, as we develop these coastal resiliency plans, to provide either land for salt marsh migration, restoration areas, or potentially contribute to research needs. So one of the things that was highlighted in parts of the coastal resiliency plan here was to understand more about the tidal flow under the road. And we're starting a project this year. We're looking at salinity and some tidal flow, installing some tide flow gauges to get at some of that information that we're going to do because it's interesting to us and a research project for us, but then we also provide information for the town. And then this is just my last slide to go back to education, but also talk about advocacy. You know, different land trusts and nonprofit organizations have different policies about advocacy, but there's different ways you can be an advocate. So while my organization doesn't typically take an advocacy stand, we can partner with a lot of organizations that have a specific climate change action focus. And so while we can, you know, work with other organizations and leverage our expertise and our small organization to kind of assist with these kind of bigger, broader, island-wide organizations. And we can participate in groups that work directly on the ground on climate action. And I'll just point out this photo on the bottom right is actually one of Dr. Jen Karberg's projects, but this was a great project. I slid this photo in here because it's an example of a couple of nonprofits working together, Nantucket Conservation Foundation and Mass Audubon, working with a neighborhood association, as well as the town and others, to do a restoration planting. And then many organizations, including my own, assisted in the transplant of seagrass to kind of in a restoration of this area. That is the very quick way to say, if you have more questions, you can ask Jen about this project. But it's a kind of a thing, working in a community like Nantucket, individual organizations can have bigger projects, but we all work together. As Jen was saying before, we all want to raise the awareness of our individual organizations, but sometimes the best way to do that is leverage our partnerships and work together to kind of actually, solve some bigger picture problems and issues. So with that, I think that was my last slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily and the Nantucket Land Council.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah and Jen, for kicking us off here. So yeah, I'm Emily Molden. I'm the executive director of the Nantucket Land Council, and our organization is a little bit different, again, from the previous two that you heard about. The Land Council was founded in the 70s, the mid 70s, and the purpose of creating the Land Council was really as an environmental advocate for the island. We are somewhat distinct from the Conservation Foundation and the Lindeloy Nature Foundation in that we don't actually own any of our own property. We have a number of programs. Specifically, we focus on land protection, on research, education, and advocacy. Sarah, you could go to the next slide. And similarly to Sarah and Jen, we have really been working to look at how we can better adapt climate change into our mission and into our programs. So we're really trying to look at what's already in our wheelhouse, what are we already doing, and how best to incorporate climate change into that work. So back in the 80s, with the introduction of greater tax incentives, the Land Council started to hold conservation restrictions on the island. And that really more formally cemented our identity as a land trust, and we have been doing that ever since. We now hold about 92 across Nantucket and our neighboring Tuckernuck Island. So that's a large part of our land protection program. And then in addition to that, we do quite a bit of research. We're involved in some habitat restoration. Again, we engage in as many public-private partnerships and collaborations as we can. And then finally, our foundation, again, is really in environmental advocacy across the island and that education and outreach component. Next slide, Sarah. So as far as our land protection and what a lot of land trusts can probably relate to our work with conservation restrictions, I think there's a lot of resources out there that speak now to how best to incorporate climate change implications into these documents. Certainly, it needs to be considered when thinking about purposes for new properties. On Nantucket, in an example like I have in the picture here, it can often be pretty obvious when a property is going to directly buffer erosion or provide coastal storm protection. Those are some pretty obvious purposes that are relevant to climate change and sea level rise. But there are definitely other ways to talk more broadly about ecosystem services that a property will provide long-term, rather than maybe a specific focus on vegetation communities or species that may ultimately change over time with our changing climate. So considering the impacts of climate change on purposes, but then also when you're evaluating the reserved rights and future uses of the property. Next slide. So the updated model conservation restriction that I think was finalized just last year now includes a series of additional conservation values that is also really helpful when drafting these documents. One is floodplain protection and long-term flood storage. That's obviously very relevant. Habitat connectivity and ecosystem integrity. I think that again speaks back to some of those broader ecosystem services. And it's really important to identify those for the properties we're protecting beyond just specific species that may be relevant today. And overall climate change resiliency is another value that is identified in our state template now that previously was not as a great option for appropriate properties. Next slide. So getting back to those permitted acts and reserved rights, I think there's probably many of us, and again, this is a more coastal relevant example, but that start to see in older restrictions some issues that maybe arise that weren't originally anticipated. You may recognize the north head of Long Pond here in this property because this is actually the Linda Nature Foundation's property, which was protected with a conservation restriction before it was given to them. And it was done at a time when we weren't thinking as much about the implications of sea level rise long-term. And you can see pictured here a couple of building envelopes that were set aside in the reserved rights of those restrictions. And ultimately, as the organization considers their future use of those building envelopes, they now are rightfully so concerned about the implications in the next several decades on those building envelopes. So this is something that we're working with them on, and we may be approaching the state about some amendments to try to address this. But again, I think it just speaks to now trying to work all of this into our CRs well in advance. Next slide. So a lot of the Land Council's research has been focused on water quality and the health of our water resources. Initially, this became our priority for a whole suite of reasons, being concerned about the overall degradation of these ecosystems from nutrient pollution. And it turns out that climate change also has serious implications, with a greater increase of storm intensity and runoff potential. It poses an even greater threat to the continued nutrient contributions to these freshwater bodies. Next slide. One of our focuses has been on harmful algal blooms, which have become more of an issue across the state and region and throughout the world. We began monitoring these blooms quite a number of years ago, largely because of the health implications and because of the outreach potential around the nutrient pollution and land use practices that influence that pollution. But again, it turns out that climate change has serious implications on these blooms, with an increased prevalence with warming climate and probably increased intensity in the years to come. So again, this monitoring program has become more relevant and more important in the face of climate change. Next slide. So as an organization that doesn't actually own any of our own land, and being a coastal community, a lot of the habitat restoration and management that we have gotten involved in has been in our aquatic ecosystems. And one great example of that is work that we began years ago looking at the health of our eelgrass. And initially, we started to get involved with our eelgrass habitat because it's such a great indicator of ecosystem health. And this particular ecosystem is facing a lot of degradation, again, largely because of water quality impacts. But once again, it turns out that eelgrass also plays a critical role in climate change concerns because of the resilience that it provides to our shorelines. It stabilizes sediment, it protects against storm intensity and waves. And it's an indicator of changing conditions. So as we have proceeded with our health assessments of these water bodies, next slide, Sarah, we have begun to collect a pretty good data set of light and temperature data in our estuaries and harbors. And that's something that our community really didn't have previously. And it's really showing us that a lot of our harbor waters are warmer than a lot of other regional estuaries. And so our eelgrass is thermally stressed, and it's going to provide a good baseline for, again, watching those conditions change as the climate warms. Next slide. So in addition to this, we also began doing some monitoring of the invasive European green crab, largely relative to eelgrass health. But once again, like many invasives, climate change may significantly improve the conditions for the species and support their population. So it's some monitoring that we initially began because we were concerned about its overall impact in the habitat, but also watching how its population changes relative to climate change is another great example of how we're incorporating it into our work and our mission. Okay, next slide, sorry. All right, so again, a lot of the foundation of the Land Council's work is with advocacy and being an environmental advocate. And so how does climate change come into play for a lot of these issues that we're concerned about? Once again, we've had a pretty big focus on the health of our waters, and that also includes our groundwater. Nantucket has a sole source aquifer, so we're very reliant on our groundwater for our drinking water and all of our other purposes. The Land Council began monitoring 10 wells across Nantucket in the 1980s for the USGS and advocating for the protection of our drinking water. So climate change and sea level rise for us do have a pretty serious implication on the long-term level of our water table, and issues such as saltwater intrusion, being the very coastal community that we are. So this is an example of a long-term data set that, again, we began collecting for a specific purpose, but it now has even greater importance in our messaging and our advocacy work that we do throughout the community. Next slide. A lot of that messaging and advocacy around water health has really focused on land use and, to a large extent, fertilizer management and reduction and landscaping practices. As you have seen from a lot of our presentation, one of the issues that Nantucket faces is rising waters, and climate change will certainly bring our waters closer to our landscaped areas. So again, incorporating that additional sense of urgency into our messaging and our advocacy is something that we have also been doing. Next. We're pretty involved as an organization in environmental regulations and policy around the island in general. And I know that's not very typical for a lot of land trusts. One area that has become even more important that we're starting to put a lot more focus on is around our island coastal resilience plan that you heard Jen and Sarah both speak about. This particular plan has some specific recommendations for how to improve our local regulations and policies around these issues. So we're really looking as an organization at how we can play a role in the public arena to facilitate the adoption and implementation of appropriate regulations and policies to address changing climate and all the considerations that go into that. And again, from a coastal perspective, that might mean one thing in your community. There are probably a lot of other ways to apply this idea. Next slide. And then the Land Council has also looked over the years quite a bit at just general growth and development across the island and policies and regulations that address the development pressure that we see on our resources and our open spaces. Again, I think just pointing out that we have to continue to reimagine our policies based on what our best projections about the future now are, because those definitely have shifted more dramatically for Nantucket than maybe some communities. But I think that, again, this is an applicable concept for everywhere. Next. And I definitely echo Sarah and Jen's sentiment around how much we value partnerships and collaborations. Public-private partnerships are really valuable for us. Out on Nantucket, we're pretty fortunate because there are a lot of fantastic partners to work with that have some really similar goals. We have really increased the impact of our harmful algal bloom monitoring with the help of the town and a lot of other conservation organizations on the island. And we all work collaboratively together on that now in order to target a much broader number of our water bodies and communicate that information to the general public through the town's website. Next slide. So some other partnerships that the Land Council has worked on over the years that have, again, a greater relevance with climate change. Being so concerned about water quality and the impact of human development and land use on our aquatic systems, particularly our harbors. This is one where we took a pretty big interest a number of years ago in stormwater impacts to our harbor in general, and began working with some engineers in the town in a number of locations. This particular location is a town-owned parking lot that's downtown, right adjacent to the harbor. And so we actually partnered with an engineering firm to help redesign the stormwater management in the parking lot and identify areas and ways that some additional bioengineering and bioretention areas could be included, some pre-treatment before that water got into the harbor, in order to provide the town some support to move forward with some of these infrastructure changes. It's just something that's still a work in progress, but with the better understanding of sea level rise and increased flooding, it's become even more relevant in recent years that some of these areas that have the potential to hold additional floodwaters are going to become increasingly important. Next slide. This is an example of another property, smaller property that's also downtown adjacent to the harbor, that through some advocacy work over a long extended period of time has been permanently protected. Another one of our partners, the Nantucket Islands Land Bank, has now purchased these lots in this area and are in the process of working to restore it. The Land Council is going to partner with them on this project and essentially put in a rain garden, improve again the flood storage, and restore the wetland habitat that exists on the site now. It'll be a great public demonstration project that the Land Council can then do a lot of PR and outreach on as an example for other homeowners who might have low-lying areas that are wet, as far as ways that they can make their properties more resilient as well. Next slide. You heard a little bit about some of these partnerships before, some other organizational collaborations on the island. Acclimate Nantucket is one that has come together specifically to bring a lot of different organizations to the table to talk about what we're all doing about climate change and how we can work together to educate the community and keep everybody engaged in all of these issues. Next slide. And then another one, the Nantucket Biodiversity Initiative, which I think is great and ties back into what Sarah was talking about. This collaboration was formed 20 years ago, essentially, by organizations that were all interested in working together to protect and improve the biodiversity on Nantucket. And as Sarah said, more diversity creates better resilience in our landscapes. And so this is just another example where we may not have known it 20 years ago when we all got together and started doing this work of the NBI, but we were creating a more resilient landscape in the face of climate change. Next slide. Okay, so that wraps up my portion of the presentation as well. I just wanted to say that in closing, we have all been really excited about this presentation and getting together, because all of our organizations, while we're land trusts, we obviously are quite different in how we're set up and how we go about fulfilling our missions. So we were hoping to be able to provide some unique perspectives on incorporating climate change into the work that we do. And once again, while we are a very coastal community and climate change implications may seem a little more clear for Nantucket, we believe that a lot of these principles can be applied anywhere. So with that, we were really interested in opening it up to some questions and conversation or dialogue. We would love to hear how your organizations are incorporating climate change into your work and into your mission, or answer some more questions about what we're doing. So I'll turn it back over to you, Abby.
Great, thank you, Emily. Everybody feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you would like to ask anything, you can raise your hand. While I'm waiting for people to do that, I just wanted to additionally mention that in addition to the conference sponsors, we had some session sponsors for this session. And we wanted to thank them. They were the Fields Pond Foundation, Horsley Witten Group, and Nantucket Conservation Foundation.
I was thinking that maybe I could stop sharing so we can kind of see each other if people do want to have a conversation. But before I do, I just wanted to note, like, take a picture if anybody wants our contact info quickly. or you can always ask us and we'll put it in the chat. So I will stop. So Abby, do you want me to, or do you want to call on people, or how would you like, how does this
I
work?
am sure, I'm happy to. And I just noticed, I don't see any questions in the chat unless I'm missing them, but I do see Josh Knox has his hand raised. So I will ask Josh to unmute, and you should be able to go ahead, Josh.
Hello, thank you for a great presentation, or I should say 3 great presentations. I had a question just to follow up on the last point made, which was an echo of an earlier point about more diversity creates more resiliency. Of course, we're not talking about invasive species when we're talking about resilience, diversity, although technically speaking, invasive species do increase biodiversity. I wonder if you could speak to this concept, which we've been talking about, I don't know, 15, 20 years now, about augmented migration, or, you know, trying to plan for the future by introducing species that, you know, weren't 100 years ago native to that area.
I can, okay. I can start us out, and then I know Jen has thoughts too. So I think it's a great question, Josh. I think this is a perfect type of meeting to have these types of conversations, right? So as you may imagine, we have had these conversations for a little while too. If you've kept up on the literature, there's lots of different ways people have talked about assisted migration or kind of facilitated movement, or, you know, whatever phrase you want to use. As an island, especially with kind of habitats that might not be found further north, we've talked about this quite a bit. So, you know, for those, so just to kind of frame the conversation, the idea of climate refugees, if you will, that need a place to go. Of course, birds and flying insects can move more easily, so we think about more plants in this way. But you know, I don't have an easy solution. For a place like Nantucket, a lot of our rare species, and I'm going to generalize here, are found in sandplain grassland habitat. So it's a globally rare habitat. So there are many fewer areas potentially further north. So our climate refugia plants that that we might want to move further north. But I think 2 things. This area of is ripe for more research for specific species, right? And I think it is for land trusts, conservation organizations, maybe, you know, natural heritage organizations among all the different states, because it's not just a biological issue, it's a permitting issue. And I know in the South, there's been some issues with rogue people moving things with the Johnny Appleseed idea of wanting to save species. And then that creates a lot of issues for land managers and things like that. So I don't have the solution, but I do think it's a really important conversation to start having for sure. Mm-hmm. Jen has thoughts.
If I could just, that was really good, Sarah. We've really just, we've talked about this, but it's really become more of an open conversation, I'd say, in the last year or two as an island, that we've definitely had a lot of resistance to the idea of bringing things or changing what's here, just that, you know, shift of the delicate island ecological balance. But I think while we don't have ideas of things we'd want to see move yet, or a clear idea of where that research is going to predict what would survive here, I think some of the management objectives we're starting to think about is, you know, making sure that the ecosystems we have or the habitats we have are functioning well, so that if something is going to move in, then hope, you know, we're not having any limits, I guess, to a natural shift or change in the ecosystem that we're seeing. So, you know, making sure that there aren't, you know, human impacts to the landscape that would limit migration. But we're really just starting to have those conversations, and it's almost a value judgment, isn't it, as far as, okay, what do we want to help move versus what are we not going to help move? That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and the only thing that I think I would add that isn't as much about assisted migration, but just kind of considering the habitat we have, and again, unique to Nantucket being an island as far as the idea of a refuge is, for example, the northern long-eared bats, which have really been doing extremely well out on Nantucket compared to in other areas as a result of white nose syndrome, which are now being proposed to be uplisted as endangered species. And again, just in consideration of species movement and what is doing well in various places and what impacts some of those migrations will have on the ecosystems and habitats. But yeah, thanks, Sarah and Jen.
Okay, Janet has the next question. You should be able to unmute Janet.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for that. That was just really, really helpful. I run a small land trust on Cape Cod, and you did just a wonderful job of a few things. One, talking about the citizen science part of it, talking and observing climate change, talking about, how our work as land trusts supports mitigation and adaptation. So thank you so much. And my question is really more about sort of your capacity. I mean, my town of Barnstable has 4 times as many people as Nantucket. Our land area is 4 times as big, and yet your capacity, I mean, 3 amazing organizations, and it looks like you partner with a lot more. You're doing really in-depth scientific research. How in the world did you kind of build this amazing capacity, which I wish we all had? And, I'll certainly have you come speak to our folks, but I'm just, the thing that struck me most about your presentation was just the amazing breadth of what you're doing there for conservation in every way.
I could kind of start us off real quick, and just to add a little humor to the dialogue, talk about how earlier Sarah, Jen, and I were joking with Abby about a session on life-work balance. But no, I think that a big piece of what Nantucket has going for it is the prevalence of conservation and environmental organizations that are out here that have, as I think you've heard, come to really understand that while we certainly all work in our own niches, we do have a lot of common and somewhat overlapping missions, and find a great way to make good use of each other's strengths and sort of facilitate those partnerships so we can build off of what each other is doing. Nantucket is also a great place in some ways to be a nonprofit, because there are so many people that can support us that really love the island and support the work that we do. So we absolutely have that going for us as well, but I'll let Sarah and Jen chime in.
No, that was really good, Emily. I think, part of it is there's a lot of support for the work that conservation groups do on the island. And so we are lucky enough as a nonprofit to have resources to support the kind of work that we're doing. It's, raising money as a nonprofit for this kind of work. Here we have a large crowd that really supports that. But I'd also say there's time, it's, my organization is over 50 years old, and initially just started as an organization that purchased land and, only had 1 employee. And eventually there was okay, we have a few more pieces of land and we have interesting shorebirds. Maybe we should hire someone to pay attention to that. And then, that built and built and built. So the support of building and doing more is part, I think, of how we've gotten to where we are now.
And I'll just jump off what Jen said, because our organization is the newest organization. So we only became operational in 2007. And we have a very small staff. And I will say that I wasn't there at the time, but I'm saying we were self-aware enough to say, okay, obviously we're place-based, so we have to do the projects and initiatives that are based on that place. But the other projects we want to do, what niche isn't being filled? Like where can we like kind of put ourselves in to be useful in this like fabric of the conservation world on the island? So I wouldn't say like to Emily's point of our overlapping missions, it's probably because we have really similar habitats and similar properties and, you know, that kind of thing. But when we're presenting together and we see the breadth of what's going on in Nantucket, some of it is that, well, I don't need to study, you know, this certain thing because someone else is already doing it, and we don't need to jump in on that because like that's their thing. And so that way we kind of diversify overall too. I think Emily had that one slide about the Nantucket Biodiversity Initiative. So that is, it's not a separate like nonprofit organization, but it's an organization of all the different conservation groups, environmental education groups, like people who are involved in the natural history of Nantucket in different ways. And that was a way too, early on, I mean, it's been about 20 years now, almost 20 years, that we were able to see what each other was doing and also identify where the holes were. So like no one is studying, because it's a small island, right? So you only have so many areas of expertise on the island. So it was a way for us to find like the holes in research too. And that's beyond just climate change. But I think for, you know, a place like Barnstable, you know, you can, I'm imagining there's kind of like localized groups of people that get together. It's hard because I think at the science and land management level, there's more interest in getting together. At the potential like executive director board level, there might be some competition for resources where that makes it somewhat more difficult. And that's why some of the leveraging things that we were talking about is, you know, we know many grant organizations like it when there's partnerships. And so kind of trying to sell it like that to the board and kind of and things like that, help within a regional area, kind of look at some of those opportunities to work together too.
We have a question from Margaret, and I'm going to put the link, because we're getting close to our end time. I'm going to put the link for the session survey in the chats for anybody who needs it. I'll put that in there in just a bit. All right, Margaret, you should be able to go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for what you said. That was really interesting. I'm an AmeriCorps member with Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, who's in the center of the state. So we're focused on a little bit different things, but I'm helping contribute to the climate action plan that we're doing and making some recommendations. My question is kind of similar to Janet's. I was wondering what, how specifically you get funding and who works on the observation and recording and monitoring for properties. Because I'm thinking about our properties and there's like, we have a good base of volunteers, but like that, wow, that's a lot of work. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Margaret, that another thing we have going for us is just the concept of scale. So like I said, my organization has 92 conservation restrictions, but I think they total 1,500 acres. And so we obviously are not as spread out as a lot of organizations are. The Land Council is all membership supported as far as our funding. We have occasionally gotten some grants from some foundations or the state, but we primarily are just funded through membership contributions. And we do have also a very small staff. We have 4 staff members now. One of the reasons that we've remained so small is we actually do use our resources to outsource some of our research and work, because we clearly aren't going to have all the expertise to do all of that. But we'll get some interns, and then we really just try to keep our research programs to a level that can be managed and maintained with our small staff. But we definitely do also outsource. And so sometimes we'll fundraise specifically for projects with that purpose. But we also do have an endowment that supports us as well.
I can just really speak briefly because we only have 4 staff as well. We have an endowment that supports the staff, so I don't have to write grants for the staff time. but because we have a small staff, we're limited in like more like time as to what we're able to do. So when we add projects like monitoring projects, we really have to prioritize what we have time for. So usually when we add a project, like you're saying about kind of figuring out the monitoring and data collection piece, we prioritize the first ones, you know, what maybe was the most important. Anything else we ask, is it like support the mission? Does it advance the strategic plan? And do we have the time to do it? And then if we don't have the time, then it's on the wish list. And I will say that we also have the benefit of, because people like to come to Nantucket, we can often try to encourage researchers to like use our property for research purposes. I don't know, you said you're in the, I don't know actually where Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust is, but you said the middle of the state. So I'm thinking like there's lots of universities over there. If you can advertise things like that, there's, you know, specific areas of research that you'd like to see done, and maybe partner with any of the academic institutions that are always, you know, grad students are always looking for a place to do stuff. That might be a way to try to help with some particular projects anyway.
And I don't have much to add there. Their summary is kind of summarized how we get our money and how we do our work. Although I will say that we have a larger staff for the foundation, and yet we still find that time is restrictive for all of the number of projects. You can still hit a barrier for the amount of work you can get done, even when you have a larger staff.
Thank you.
We are at our time, but we have one more question in the chat, if it's okay to take that. Looks like I see some nodding. So Jessica Grigg asks, I'm curious about how much pesticide use you have to deal with, what the culture is on the island, homeowner resistance, etc.
That's a great question, and one that we can all kind of speak to how our organizations have been dealing with that. We do use very targeted herbicide application for invasive species control. Really Phragmites is the biggest one that we are focusing on. And I speak for all these groups, but I know that how we try and use it in application is, as targeted and focused and efficient as possible. There is a rising resistance on the island, I would say, to herbicide use. There's the broad resistance against, glyphosate Roundup that kind of keeps coming up every couple months or so. We continue the message of the fact that it's a tool that we use and that we try and use responsibly. Here's how we use it. And then if we don't use it, the other options are probably worse than the one that we're currently using. I would say that's the message that we are kind of working through. Sarah, Emily, did you want to add to any of that fun?
I think you said it really well. It's really interesting to me to see the dichotomy of like the conservation groups and the land managers, and that like as a group, people use it as a tool, as Jen said, it's like one tool in the toolbox. And then as a community, we've realized we could do some education too about how targeted it is and what the alternatives are and that kind of thing in a way.
And I'll just add sort of from a maybe bigger picture and slightly different perspective. There have been a couple of different citizen warrant articles at town meetings over the years to prohibit glyphosate use across the island completely. So there definitely is, as Jen said, some real concern about herbicides particularly and pesticides in general. But then from a different perspective of land use sort of advocacy, we have such a huge amount of professional landscaping that goes on Nantucket. I'm sure wherever Janet was on the Cape, it's the same in some other communities. There are a lot of landscaping companies that do go out and will use sort of a broad conventional lawn application that actually includes pesticides that they may not even know about. I think there's a lot more application to properties than people realize. And being out here on Nantucket, there's not very much enforcement. I think maybe there was like one day over the last 2 or 3 years that I've heard of when an enforcement officer from the state came out to try to check in on pesticide applicator licenses, and they just can't get very much done in one afternoon on the island. So it's interesting. I mean, that's sort of a different perspective than from the land trust habitat restoration perspective, but just because I'm not sure exactly where the question was coming from, I thought I'd throw that out there as well.
Thank you. I just struggle every spring with our towns. They've bought into, they've hired this company that we use every year for close to $85,000. And we have to opt out every single private, you have to go through a process. It's really not a big deal, but everybody does think it's a big deal. And I put out, here's the link, you can do it online. And as the land trust, we opt out, every single one of our properties, but it's just fascinating, that people are discussing salt marsh, recuperation, and, we're rescuing land, and we're trying to, discuss and teach people about diversity and creatures. And then they go and dump all this stuff on their lawns. Anyway, thank you for discussing it.
Jessica, I was really interested. So I was thinking at first that you were talking about like herbicide, like we do for non-native species. But when you looked back and you said pesticide, we had a thing when I first started at our organization, we were having a cocktail party fundraiser, and the committee for our fundraiser was like scheduling the guy to come and spray the herbicide so that there were no mosquitoes on the night of the cocktail party. And I was like, no, that's not the point. Like, we're studying the native pollinators. You're going to spray them off. It's an education thing. Yes. Yeah. I'm totally with you there.
Yeah. And then we have people in town who cry because their beehives have been, we have a friend who 40 hives dead. And it's like,
it's an education. Yeah. Monarch butterflies, all the kids raise monarch butterflies. And that's another issue that I hate, but, and then they release them and then, yeah, it's a.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you to Jen, Sarah, and Emily for fantastic presentations.